that the rudder had been torn apart in two major pieces and some parts were missing. In particular, the doors between the fin and the rudder were missing.
The shroud doors are two small doors located on the vertical fin of the plane. They provide mechanics with access to weights inside the fin that control the rudder's movement. Heimdall makes a dramatic find about the doors themselves. They were constructed with an aluminium honeycomb liner. From his days in the Air Force, Heimdall knows they have a unique property.
This is thin aluminum foil, as you know, and it has the good reflective properties for radar, and it's very light. The military use it to disturb radar signals, call it chaff.
Investigators now realize that the unidentified object picked up by Swedish radar was probably a piece of one of the shroud doors.
But when we connected the missing doors and honeycomb with the radar data, we knew that it had happened up at cruising altitude because the slow-falling object had come from very high level, cruising altitude practically.
Investigators conclude that the tail began to break apart at 22,000 feet before it plummeted from the sky. But why had the doors fallen off in mid-flight? Whatever caused the shroud doors to tear off likely caused the crash. Investigators know that the rudder's counterweights are located just inside the shroud doors. If a rudder moves too violently from side to side, the weights do as well.
We found enough pieces to show that it was just pounding these doors. And the first real components that came off were the honeycomb in those doors.
Investigators conclude that around the time of the accident, something caused the rudder to swing violently back and forth, but they still don't know what.
The APU with the broken front shock mount on its own, running in flight, would not cause the aircraft to come apart and the tail to come apart. There had to be extra factors there for that to occur.
Investigators continue searching for those extra factors. Then Partner Airlines proposes one. They point to the F-16 that passed over the plane just minutes before the plane veered off course.
Whoa, look at that, 11 o'clock. F-16.
Partner claims the military jet was flying faster than it should have been. They also believe that it came much closer to the flight than officially reported.
Partner, they contacted the Swedish investigator, and he came out with the answer that the F-16 could probably have gone through the sound barrier as it passed just over the partner plane. When a fighter jet or any other plane breaks the sound barrier, you have this pressure wave, and their theory was that this pressure wave just got the plane to disintegrate in the air.
But the Norwegian F-16 pilot testifies that he was more than 1,000 feet above the Convair when he passed it. Investigators calculate just how close the F-16 would have had to be in order to seriously disturb Flight 394. They determined that for the F-16's pressure wave to have affected the Convair, it would have had to fly within a few meters of the plane. There's no evidence the two planes were ever that close.
Okay, good work.
90% of the plane's wreckage has been recovered from the sea. But investigators still don't know what caused the Convair's tail to come off in mid-air. During the course of the investigation, Finn Heimdall is given a promotion. But he has no idea how to solve the puzzle that haunts his nation.
They asked me to be in charge of the rest of the hardware investigation. I was standing in a heap of wrecked parts and thinking I'll never get to an end of this.
Investigators get a break when the faulty flight data recorder is analyzed in the United States. The manufacturer has asked its top expert to come out of retirement and examine the device.
Manufacturer Fairchild referred us to a previous employee, and we found him in California.
The expert tells investigators that the needle that was supposed to be recording the plane's altitude was shaking so much that it was leaving another mark on the foil. But then he goes one step further. The FDR has a capacity to record for hundreds of hours. By unspooling the metal foil completely, he sees that the FDR has been vibrating severely for months.
We saw that this had happened something like 360 operations hours before the accident.
I had never seen an abnormality like that before, and it took us a while to figure out what was going on here.
It now seems the APU wasn't the only thing vibrating on this plane. Investigators decide to chart the history of the vibrations chronologically. They notice an unusual change in the pattern of vibrations. 2 months before the crash, the vibrations suddenly stopped for a number of weeks.
Virtually no vibrations for at least 16 flights.
It was increasing intensity and frequency up to the summer of '89. And then the pattern changed.
After getting better, the pattern of vibrations got worse again, right up until the crash.
What happened here?
Investigators now need to find out what changed on the plane during the 2-week period when the vibrations stopped.
Why was it out of service? Where was the work done?
The airline tells investigators that during that time, the plane was receiving a major overhaul in Western Canada.
Thank you. We'll be in touch.
The work was done by the plane's previous owner, a Canadian company that specializes in servicing Convair. During the various test flights there, the FDR recorded almost no excessive vibrations. This healthy pattern continued on several passenger flights once the overhaul was done and the plane returned to Norway. Investigators review the maintenance records. Heimdall finds that during the overhaul, mechanics found signs of wear on one of the 4 bolts that connect the vertical fin to the plane's tail. These 4 bolts are the only things holding the tail to the fuselage. During the overhaul of the Convair in July of 1989, a mechanic replaced one of the 4 bolts. The information from the flight data recorder reveals that the vibrations in the tail stopped right after that 1 bolt was replaced.
You see that? And as they go across...
Incredibly, investigators are able to recover all 4 of the bolts which were holding the tail in place. Terry Heaslip thoroughly analyzes the bolts. He makes a final stunning discovery. The 3 bolts that weren't replaced were not approved parts.
We did metallurgical testing and we did mechanical testing. And by doing all of these analyses, we worked out that the 3 of the assemblies were not up to scratch. They were bogus assemblies.
His analysis shows that the faulty bolts were incorrectly heat-treated when they were made. As a result, they are only 60% as strong as they should have been. Investigators finally know why the tail was vibrating for months.
Got something for me?
3 of the bolts holding it in place were too weak.
They just weren't hard enough. Unbelievable.
3 bolts holding the tail to the rest of the plane were not authentic parts. They were well-disguised fakes. The weak bolts mean investigators now must answer a critical question.
Why didn't the tail come off in the previous 16 flights where it vibrated excessively? Why this last flight?
Investigators already know that on the day of the accident flight, a power generator wasn't working, and that the pilots improvised a solution.
Okay, I want you to write this in the logbook. Released for flight with APU generator operative. We'll use the APU to power the left side AC system. APU is coming on.
The pilots didn't realize that the APU mount was broken and the motor was vibrating considerably. Their decision to run it throughout the flight made a bad situation worse.
The reason why things got bad on this particular flight is that the APU was literally floating on 2 mounts instead of 3.
This, along with the faulty bolts, created even more vibrations in the tail of the plane.
And when you get the 2 of them shaking, if they ever get into sync, what we call resonance with each other, disaster.
The investigators conclude that the vibrations in the tail and the vibrations from the APU could have combined into a lethal force.
Now, this is what we got from the guys at MIT. Technically, the vibrations could have torn the plane apart.
If the 2 loose items start to vibrate in the same frequency, now you're going to get, or a multiple of that frequency, you get what's called coupled harmonics. And the one vibration is feeding the other one. They're feeding each other and making each other worse and worse.
The most famous example of coupled harmonics occurred on the Tacoma Narrows Bridge in Washington State in 1940. The newly built steel and concrete bridge began swaying lengthwise, and then a crosswind started dipping it left to right. The 2 vibrations moving in different directions combined to create a violent twisting motion that tore the bridge apart. Investigators calculate that the same effect tore apart Flight 394.
And we said, my gosh, that's exactly the phenomenon we have here.
This lethal combination of vibrations caused the tail to sway back and forth so violently that the rudder jammed to the left. This forced the plane into a left turn so abrupt that it increased airflow over the right wing, creating greater lift and causing the aircraft to roll. The plane recovered briefly, but the rudder jams to the left again, and the shroud doors explode. It rolls a second time. The tail begins to disintegrate. After that, the crew didn't have a hope. Investigators conclude that it was the 3 bogus bolts that initiated the partner crash.
And I looked at that and said, man, oh man, how could that be in a crucial component, a crucial fitting like that in the tail? I couldn't believe it.
The report on Partner Flight 394 sends shockwaves throughout the aviation industry. It's the first time that a fatal plane crash has been linked to unapproved spare parts. It raises a frightening question. How many of the parts being put into planes around the world are bogus?
The Partner crash, that was the seminal event that started people actually having to recognize the unapproved parts problem and the fact that the worldwide inventories of aircraft parts, in fact, were contaminated.